Let's look at some of the blade technology available to historical sword makers. Hey folks, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria and also of Easton Antique Arms. I deal in antique weapons and I also teach historical fencing, as regular viewers of this channel will know, of course. But before I go on, I want to talk about the sponsors for this video, who very kindly are March of Empires, which is a free-to-play, free-to-download strategy medieval empire building game, which you should check out right now. There's a download link below this video. March of Empires is a fantastic old-school MMO strategy and empire building game. You can choose to be a Highland King or a Desert Sultan or a Northern Tsar. Once you've chosen your faction, you can build up your kingdom. You can build barracks, houses, you can engage in every aspect of the economy and making your military as powerful as possible so you can conquer your enemies. March of Empires is an absolutely fantastic game for fans of history, military history, warfare, combat, wargaming and strategy in general. And incidentally, if you're playing a Desert Sultan, for example, you might be using something like this shamshir here, and these very often were made of woots or crucible steel, just as dealt with in this video. So a lot of the technologies that we're talking about here, you absolutely would find within the context of March of Empires. If you want to help support the channel, go and check out the game, check out the link below, and I hope you have a good time with it. So thanks very much for sticking with me. Now let's get back to historical swords and the steel used in their construction. We're particularly talking about steel blades here, and also the way that they were hardened, and these two things are connected, okay? So what I'm holding here is a 19th century sword. Now, this, by the 18th and 19th century in Europe specifically, we get to what essentially was at the time known as cast steel, we would call it mono steel blades, that were through hardened and then tempered. So they were made very much in a similar way to how a modern replica, or indeed how most modern knives are made. So they're made of a mono steel and they are quenched in oil usually, all the way through to give a high level of uniform hardness, and then they are tempered to increase the toughness of the blade, reduces the hardness a little bit but makes it far less brittle. Okay, so most people, anyone who watches something like a show like Forged in Fire, will be only too well aware of the standard way of making modern knife blades, modern replica sword blades. But this wasn't always how things were done historically for a number of reasons. And those reasons, as I've said, they come down partly from necessity and partly from desire. Okay, so partly due to the materials available, or shall we more broadly say the technology available, and we'll unpack that in a second. And then secondly, what do you actually need from your blade? So clearly the needs of a wakizashi blade here is a very different requirements in terms of the steel that you might want, in terms of the heat treatment that you might use. Very different to something like a rapier or a small sword, for example, which is a thrusting weapon. It's very narrow and this sort of thing. So you want completely different qualities and characteristics from those two blades. Now what I'm holding here is a replica of a 15th century knightly sword, should we call it, an arming sword, and a Edo period 19th century wakizashi made in the traditional way. Now, something that I have noticed when involved in all sorts of discussions and reading various things online, online discussions, and also watching even documentaries on the subject of sword making, is that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of the fact that certain types of blade technology were used quite differently in different places at the same time by different cultures and different people. And in many cases, the choices they made about how to make a blade, what type of steel to use, was sometimes born out of what was available and sometimes born out of what was preferable within the context of that particular area. So for example, what type of blade you wanted to make, whether it was a thrusting blade or a cutting blade, whether it was going to be used against metallic armour or other types of armour or no armour. And so there's actually a big variety in the way that blades are made historically, and that's what we're going to look at in this video. In contrary, I think a lot of people in the modern world are used to replicas which are made of a modern mono steel like 5160 or 1095, which is through hardened, oil quenched and then tempered, which is a pretty much standard way of making blades these days. but wasn't necessarily at all the standard way of making blades historically. So that's what we're going to unpack a little bit in this video. So if we now go back, all the way back to the medieval period, okay, so the early medieval period is when a lot of the metallurgical traditions that we see right the way through the medieval period and into the Renaissance, and in some cases all the way to the 20th century, is sort of when they were established. So in this period, you've essentially got two main types, or you could divide steel production into two main types. Okay, there is steel that is made through the bloomery process, and later on with so-called blister steel as well. Okay, so we put those on one side, and then you put on the other side what we would call crucible steel. Now, crucible steel was high technology and was the precursor to modern steel, in the sense that a crucible steel is iron which has been completely melted down to liquid state and then has had carbon added. Remember that steel is essentially iron plus a bit of carbon, between about 0.5% and 1 point something percent, so around 1%. Okay, so you add a tiny bit of carbon to iron and you get steel, and steel is hardenable. Okay, so in the medieval period, steel would have been defined as if you heat it up to red hot and you quench it in something, be it oil or water or whatever, if it becomes hard and brittle, that's steel. If nothing happens to it, that's iron. Okay, so if you have below a certain amount of carbon content, it would be classed as iron. In the modern world, also mild steel, and that is not hardenable through a quenching process. You can work harden it, but you can't harden it through quenching. So essentially, in the medieval period, we've got steels which are formed by not melting and steel which is formed by melting. Okay, and in most of the world they were not capable of melting steel yet because of the temperatures being too high to achieve that. Crucible steel, however, was produced in a few places, most famously in India, and that was exported out of India, and it found its way through various trade routes into the Middle East, where it was formed into the famous Damascus blades of that area, and also it found its way even up into Scandinavia, or perhaps Germany, where it was formed into these famous Ulfbert blades. Now, Ulfbert blades, unlike all of the other medieval swords at that time, around the year 1000 AD, Ulfbert blades were made of crucible steel. Okay, so they're made of steel which is, the iron has been liquefied and then had carbon added to it, and you end up with a very homogeneous mono steel, basically, blade. Whereas the other blades were formed through various forms of forging at very high temperatures to try and even out, spread out, and to some degree get out some of the impurities and inclusions that you didn't want in there. So one way of doing this is folding the steel over and over again. So if you imagine something like a piece of Play-Doh or plasticine, if you imagine you've got a lump of yellow Play-Doh and it's got some purple bits in it, you think that's a bit unsightly, so you fold the plasticine over and over and over again and you spread out that purple so that essentially it's spread evenly through the whole mass. This is similar to the things you don't want in your piece of steel to make a blade, because those are inherent points of weakness. They're a point where the blade could break. So there were ways through repeatedly folding and reforging, even putting bits of the steel in a sort of container with carbon producing things as well to increase the carbon content. There's various ways you can work with that steel to make it a better blade steel, but it's never going to be quite as homogeneous, or you could argue quite as good, as steel which has come from a liquefied state, known in the medieval world, in a medieval context anyway, as crucible steel, and that is similar to modern steel. So as I say, the vast majority of blades in the world had not been in a liquefied state. They'd been made from iron, which had been repeatedly processed but not liquefied. Okay, so the swords which were made from crucible steel, liquefied steel, were generally regarded, they were very, very rare, very, very valuable, and better quality. And of course, famously, they were used to produce Wootz blades, known by other names as well in various places, and indeed the famous Damascus blades. Now, I understand there's some confusion here because in the modern world, Damascus has come to be associated with pattern welded blades. I'll talk about pattern welded blades in a minute, but actually originally Probably, there's some debate over this, but probably the term Damascus was not applied to pattern welded blades, but applied to Woots, in other words, Crucible Steel blades. Now we're going to look very briefly at Woots, and I'm very lucky to have an example behind me here. So this is an example of a British officer's hilt mounted on an almost certainly Indian, could be Persian, but probably Indian blade. And if I bring it very close to the camera, we hopefully will be able to get it to focus. You'll be able to see, there we go, the pattern in the steel. And that is a big piece of Woots. You'll notice also that the bottom of the blade here is darker than the top, and that's to do with the quenching process, and we talk about quenching in a minute. But this is a massive, great piece of Woots, one of the biggest bits of Woots I've ever seen, actually. These were very, very highly prized, very, very good quality, and they weren't always heat treated in the same way that other steel blades were, but that's something I'll leave. That gets complicated, and I'll leave that for a future separate video, I think. Let's put that down here. So Woots blades were highly valued, highly sought after, but to most people they weren't attainable, they weren't available at all, even to very wealthy people. Certainly the average medieval knight couldn't get hold of a Crucible Steel blade. They were, for the most part, certainly in the high medieval period, they were using something that we would call blister steel, which did produce a good quality blade, and you can get good blades out of it, but it's not really as homogeneous and reliable in its quality as a Crucible Steel. So now let's look at all of those other swords, whether they're from Europe or India or China or Japan or wherever else, that are produced with that other steel that has not been liquefied. So here I've got a replica medieval sword. I don't own any original medieval swords, unfortunately. I think the earliest swords I've got are from the end of the 17th century. But if we go back to the medieval period, the vast majority of medieval European swords were made with bloomery and later blister steel, and essentially are, if you imagine a billet of iron which has been carburized, has carbon added to it, and then is repeatedly heat forged essentially and folded and stuff like this. So it's never been liquefied, but nevertheless you can get a good quality blade out of it. But the thing you have to be aware of is that medieval blades did have a lot of inclusions and impurities in them. So when we x-ray and examine medieval sword blades, original medieval sword blades that would look like this but less shiny, they have a lot of inclusions like slag in them, which is from the process of making them, and indeed a lot of other elements in there that might not be particularly favourable or desirable, and in a perfect world you'd reduce the percentage of some of those elements that are in there. That does mean that these blades have some inherent weaknesses in their structure. It also means that when you heat treat these blades, sometimes the heat treatment isn't the same throughout the blade, because the blade isn't homogeneous the right way through. So when it's quenched, it doesn't quench to the same level in all the same parts of the blade at the same time, or as quickly. So you do get variable hardness in medieval sword blades, and in general I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of medieval sword blades are not as good quality as some of the sword blades being made in India or the Middle East at that time, and equally they're nowhere near as good quality as modern replicas. So this is a modern replica made out of EN45 steel, this happens to be, which is a British Sheffield grade of carbon steel, a bit similar to something like 1095. So it's got a high level of carbon, but it is homogeneous and uniform throughout, and this was quenched with, obviously with thermometers. They know the exact temperature it was quenched at, and then it was tempered in a tempering oven for a long period of time. So this has been done with modern technology and modern materials, not something that was possible in medieval Europe. Now you might be wondering at that point, well, if a medieval European could get hold of some Crucible steel, would they have valued it? The answer is yes, and we know that from the Ulfbert swords. So the Ulfbert swords were made out of imported Crucible steel, probably originating in India. It could have come via the Middle East, we don't really know. This is an area of current research. They valued these incredibly highly, probably amongst the most highly valued blades in that period, around 1000 AD. So but they formed them into swords of their own shape. So they didn't just import a blade from India, they got the steel from India. Perhaps in some cases they may have even got blades and then reforged them into the shape of the sword that they thought was good, which at the time was an arming sword to be used with a shield, predominantly a kite shield at that point. So absolutely, they thought the steel was good and they used it if they had access to it. There is a parallel, incidentally, with Japan here. So we'll talk about the construction of Japanese blades briefly in a minute. But the Japanese, when they had access to imported steel from places like Spain and Portugal later on, from the 17th century onwards mostly, they did in fact absolutely use it. And we find it used in armour. Certainly breastplates and helmets from Spain and Portugal, and in some cases the Netherlands and England, were highly valued and incorporated into traditional samurai armour, with adornments and additions and artistic changes to it, but essentially you can still recognise the breastplates in this. So absolutely, and gun barrels is the other famous thing. So absolutely, when they could import those steel products, they absolutely did, and I think pretty much everyone in history has done that. Now, Japanese swords are interesting in that they are a little bit similar to medieval European swords in the way that they're produced. They have a different way of obtaining the steel tamahagane, which is actually made out of very fine sand-like granules. And what this has the effect of doing, the way that they produce it, is that it means that any inclusions are very, very small, and they're very, very spread out in the material. So actually tamahagane steel is very good quality, but it is not liquefied. It's not like crucible steel, and it's not like modern steel actually. So tamahagane is, you could argue, not as good as modern steel, despite the fact that it's still highly valued and highly sought after for traditional reasons. Mechanically speaking, it still has some of the problems of medieval European blades, but those problems are reduced down essentially. So tamahagane is a very good way of producing steel to reduce those inclusions, reduce those impurities, and make a blade which is almost homogeneous steel. It's very close to homogeneous steel, and it will certainly, when it comes to things like heat treating, it will avoid a lot of the problems that medieval European blades have. Now, just briefly back to medieval European blades. So here I've got a basket hilted backsword with a blade which probably dates to the 1700s, but it could be 1600s. And some of these blades later on were being made of cast steel, but the earlier ones were being made of the traditional medieval types of steel. Now, it's famous in Europe that certain blade making centres made steel of above average quality. Toledo in Spain is very famous for that. Certain parts of Italy, Milan, Brescia in Italy were quite famous for making very good quality blades. Bordeaux in France, which is not the Bordeaux that's the famous Bordeaux, it's another place in France as I understand it. Solingen in Germany, and in fact the whole Rhineland really. And certain parts of Scandinavia as well. So the fact is that some places did have purer, for want of a better term, sources of iron, and they produced higher quality, more homogeneous steel than other places, and that steel was highly valued and exported to numerous places. So you can find a Scottish basket hilted sword with a Solingen blade on it, or an Andrea Ferrara blade on it, or a Toledo blade on it, and they were traded all over Europe because of course there was a lot of interconnectivity between different kingdoms and cultures in Europe at this time. Now, let's talk about pattern welding. So there's also the Sanmai kind of elephant in the room as well. So essentially these are relatable things in that if you have a steel which has impurities in it, if you accept it's going to have some slag in it, it's going to have some elements in there you don't really want, and they are distributed not particularly evenly through the metal, through the object, what you want to do is find ways of, again, of evening out. So folding is one way, but also and this is where we connect to edge hardness and hardening. So the other element to these blades is you might want a flexible blade, you might want a stiff blade, you might want a blade that's able to bend and be straightened again, or you just might be fixated on having a very, very hard edge. Okay, so let's start off with a typical European blade, which is kind of the simplest in a sense. Okay, here we've essentially got a spring. Okay, so this is a flexible spring, and certainly if you're going to make many types of European sword, including things like rapiers or small swords, which are very narrow, they need to have a degree of flexibility to them. They need to be flexible. Now, in order to be flexible, you need fairly reliable steel. It needs to be through quenched and through tempered, because that's how you create a spring. Okay, so these blades are springs, and most European blades are indeed springs. What are the advantages to springs? Well, number one, they're springy. Okay, so you can make something long and narrow like a rapier or a small sword, and it won't just snap, because it's got springiness to it, and it won't just bend. Okay, lots of other swords made around the world weren't long and narrow like a rapier or a small sword, and so they didn't need to have that springiness, and it didn't matter if something could bend, because they would maybe made a type of blade that was much thicker. For example, the Japanese swords like this wakizashi or a katana or a tachi, they were much thicker, so it would be more difficult to bend them. Okay, so for many types of European swords, it suited having a springy blade. Now the question obviously next is chicken and egg. Which is it that they were using springy heat treatment with a steel that could take it that led to the development of those types of blades, or was it the development of those type of blades that kept them with that type of heat treatment? We don't know. I would say that probably the former. So the fact that they had steel that you could through harden and temper and turn into a spring probably led to the designs that became prevalent in Europe. There is a secondary question, and that is about what you're hitting with those swords. And obviously armour was a big thing in Europe. And if you're repeatedly hitting metallic armour, be it mail, chainmail originally, but then added plates, things like the coats of plates, big great helms, and then more and more plate armour. If you're hitting metallic armour with some of these swords, and not to say that swords were always used to hit armour, because it's not the most effective way to use a sword, but nevertheless, if you were hitting armour, of any metallic armour of any sort with swords, a springy blade is a good thing. Edge hardness, not so important, because you're not going to cut through the armour most of the time, but you want your sword to not bend and not snap, and to be able to be resilient when it's impacting these types of very tough armour. So I think all of these things are interconnected, and definitely springy blades were popular in Europe for a whole bunch of reasons. But they do have arguably one disadvantage, and that is certainly in the medieval world, using medieval steel that was available, it does mean that they're a little bit more prone to snapping, perhaps, and secondly, it means that their edges can't be quite as hard as they were in certain other places. So now let's fly back to Japan, and they took a completely different approach and a completely different blade design. They go for very thick blades, very thick spine, with not as much distal taper or taper as we go along the blade. In other words, they don't get very, very thin like European swords do. So they're very thick, but they retain, because of the way they're quenched, they're edge quenched, which produces the famous wavy line on the hamon. So you've got a very hard edge, water quenched incidentally. Water quenching is very high failure rate, but also can produce a harder edge because the cooling rate is higher. So can produce a harder edge, a very hard edge that is supported by a softer back. And indeed, I'm certainly not going to do it with this lovely antique, but if I took the blade by the other end and bent it as hard as I could, it would bend and stay bent. Okay. But because it's a thick blade, it's less likely to do that than some of the thinner European or even Chinese blades, or even in some cases Indian blades as well. So it's a thick blade, not particularly broad, you'll notice. They've taken the same amount of material and built it up in the thickness of the blade so that it's more resilient to bending, but a very hard edge. As a typical comparison, a medieval European sword blade might be around 40-45 Rockwell at the edge. That's a hardness measure, whereas a Japanese sword might be 60 Rockwell at the edge. So these are significantly harder at the edge. They can therefore maintain an edge to some degree anyway, depending what targets you're hitting, for longer, and retain their sharpness. But important to note, these edges are more brittle. So whilst they are harder, they are also more brittle, and these two things often go hand in hand with steel, unfortunately. So if you started mashing a beautiful wakizashi or katana into European plate armour, it wouldn't cut through it like in some movies I've seen. It would chip the edge of this blade. And in fact, very often in the antiques world, we find lovely antique Japanese blades that do carry a number of chips in them, either from impacts against other weapons or against things like helmets or buckles or all sorts of bits of equipment, okay? So absolutely, Japanese sword edges are very hard, but they are more brittle. A European sword edge, if I go to this sabre, so by the time we get to monosteel blades in the 19th century, this will be around 50 Rockwell at the edge, so it's now harder because they can get it harder with less risk, partly because of the technology. They're better at heat treating things by that point, but also this is monosteel, so it's got less rubbish in the blade essentially. This is essentially a crucible or cast steel as they called it. So we can have a harder edge than the medieval swords, but if this edge hits something hard, it won't crack or chip so much as just kind of dent. It will get a curl, it will take a notch, but it won't break, it won't shatter, it won't lose bits of material out of the edge like Japanese swords tend to do. So hardness and toughness, you tend to have to weigh them up, and if you want more hardness, unfortunately you get more brittleness and you give up some of your toughness. Now it's worth mentioning pattern welding again, because this comes into this back into this kind of comparison, I suppose. And in the medieval sword world, certainly by the date of this sword, 15th century, they were just making swords out of one piece of processed steel essentially. But if we go back to the Viking era, pattern welded blades were popular, and if we go all the way back in fact to the Roman era, pattern welded blades were an option for making a blade. Again, it's about spreading out the rubbish that you don't want in the blade, things like the slag and other stuff. But also it means that what you can do is you can weld a hard edge around a softer body. And you'll notice that this is a little bit like sanmai, and it's a little bit like the way that some Japanese sword blades are made, where you've got a hard edge and a softer back. This is actually done in Europe, in medieval Europe, since the Roman era, since the late Roman era. So absolutely throughout the migration period and the Viking era and early medieval period, you do find blades sometimes which have hard carbon steel forge welded onto a pattern welded body. And this gives you kind of the best of both worlds. It's very labor intensive, very expensive, very time consuming to make, very big cost in materials as well. Think of the amount of charcoal you have to use up. But you've essentially then got an interlaced or lattice construction of bars up the centre, which are forge welded together, and then hard steel, almost not quite monosteel, but a harder, higher carbon content steel around the edge. And this is a similar kind of strategy to what the Japanese are doing, of having a hard edge and a softer body. One thing we also have to mention as well is even with a monosteel blade, when it's quenched, the edges being thinner will quench, cool down more quickly than the body of the blade. So even with a modern monosteel, if it's quenched simply in oil, for example, the edges will be slightly harder than the body of the blade in general, because they cool down quicker because they're thinner and they lose heat quicker therefore. Now we've talked about pattern welding, let's move on to Indian swords. Okay, so we've looked so far, and a lot of this could also go for Chinese swords as well. So I've got a Jian here for China, and I've got a Tolwa obviously for India. Now in India they used all of the above, so everything we've spoken about so far they used in India. So they did use Crucible Steel because they were producing it. It was probably the most expensive and highest option available to them. So the Wootz steel blades are usually associated with the real top echelons of sword making in India. They also used blades which were pattern welded to varying degrees. They used blades which were laminated or folded to varying degrees, something similar to sanmai. In addition, let's talk about quenching for a second. There are essentially two options with quenching. Okay, you either quench the whole blade in one go and then you temper it, or you quench just the edge Or there's an in-between option which the Japanese do, and that is a differential hardened. So quite simply, if I heat this up to quenching temperature, when it loses magnetism, it's about 800–900 degrees C depending on the steel, and then I plunge this into oil, I'll now have a very hard but very brittle blade, and then I will temper it by heating it up to roughly blue surface colour and leaving it at that temperature for a while, and that will leave me with a tough springy blade. Okay, so that's how most modern knives are made and most modern replica swords. Some, and if I go to a different option here, if I go to the Nepalese cookery, some blades are heated up to that quenching temperature and then have water poured along their edge, and you can still see people today in Nepal hardening the edges of cookeries by using a teapot, which I love, using a teapot to pour water along the edge here. So in other words, they are just hardening the edge and they're leaving the back soft, because that's what you need with something that's really fat and thick, like a cookery, or indeed something like an axe. Just quench the edge. Okay. Now the Japanese, they do quench the whole blade, but what they do before quenching is they cover the back part of most of the blade, in fact everything except for the edge and the point, with clay, and that's a form of differential hardening, whereby when you put it into the water, actually we'll go that way down, when you put it into the water, the edge hardens much more quickly than the clay covered back of the blade, because of course the clay covered back of the blade is covered by clay, so the cold water can't get to it directly. So you end up still with a hard blade, but the edge is very much harder than the back. Okay, so you notice that in terms of hardening there's all of the above options. You can either quench the whole blade, you can quench just the edge, or you can quench the whole thing but cover the back of the blade such that only the edge really gets very hard. And there is another option as well, and that is sometimes when you're making the blade, if the high carbon edge is forged onto a lower carbon body, and in fact with axes, for example, it's not unheard of to put a steel edge onto an iron body, then when you quench it, the higher carbon steel will quench harder than the rest of the body of the object. Now if we go to India again, they just do all of the above. So some of the Indian swords are edge quenched, some of them are through tempered, so some Indian blades are springy. This is a springy one. Some Indian blades are not at all springy, like this Indian blade on a British officer's hilt, which is Wootz, but we can see that it has been edge quenched, probably only edge quenched, because of that dark mark I pointed out. I don't know whether you can see it in the camera at the moment, but it has a dark line all the way along the front of the edge, and that was probably done by doing this into a trough of water, I would imagine, looking at the line of it. It could have been done by pouring the water along the edge, but because that looks very regular, I think it looks like it's been dipped in water to harden it. And Indian blades can be pattern welded. As I say, they can be laminated or sanmai type constructions, or they can just be a mono steel, or they can be crucible steel. So in India, you really find all of the options available pretty much. And now China is another interesting example. So China again did some of the similar things to Japan, but it also did some of the similar things to Europe. So some Chinese blades are spring tempered, through hardened. Some of them are just edge hardened. And we find some old Chinese blades that have been repolished and re-etched. We can see the hardening line along the edge, so we see that they were either differentially hardened or just edge hardened. So I hope that gives a fairly complete overview of all of the options of the different types of steel that were in use in the medieval period and all the way through, in fact, to the early modern period. And I finally want to finish up by saying that this chicken and egg thing, so often we go, well, did they use that type of method of manufacturing the blade because of necessity, because of the technology that was available to them, or did they do it because that's what produced the best weapon for what they wanted in the type of fighting they were using it for, the type of armour that was being worn at the time? And very often it's a question of picking out individual examples. So Europe, for example, I think there's good arguments to be made for the fact that springy, tough blades were desirable in Europe, probably because of the way that they were used. There was a lot of blade-on-blade contact, a lot of smashing into opponents' shields and armour and stuff like this. Blades in Japan very rarely encountered shields. For the most part, they probably didn't encounter any armour because a lot of the soldiers they encountered weren't wearing much armour or minimal amounts of armour, and not an awful lot of metal armour. Only really the highest nobility had a lot of armour. So the needs for a Japanese blade are very different to the needs for a European blade, but added to that, the iron available in Europe, which was a huge amount and being produced in a lot of places, and there were water-driven, mills forging it with power trip hammers and everything else by the 14th century, churning out loads of steel. That steel was never that available in Japan, so resources come into it as well. And also the fact that Europe was interconnected countries, all trading with each other, trading with the Islamic world, trading all the way up with China and the Silk Roads, whereas Japan, of course, for some of its history was a bit isolationist. Even if it did take quite a lot of technology from China and give some technology back to China as well. So we've always got this very complicated, and then you take India, and India is kind of in the middle of the technology world, as it were there. It's not far from China. It's interacting with Europe through Portugal and the Netherlands primarily originally, and then later obviously with Britain. So, and the whole Islamic world all the way, India right the way through Afghanistan and Persia and all the way across to Syria and, beyond. India was very well connected, and maybe that's one of the reasons, and obviously India's a big place with a big population, maybe that's one of the reasons that we find India almost has the most diverse set of blade making and blade types for this whole period. And also individuals. So if we go again, if we stay in India for a second, we find all of the different types of blade steel manufacture and all of the different types of heat treatment and edge quenching in India. And very often, I imagine, it would have come down to the individual, because you can take 5 talwars from the 16th century or 17th century, and they've all got different types of blades. One might be pattern welded, one might be woots, one might be sort of laminated or sanmai type construction, and they all heat treated in different ways. One might be edge quenched, one might be differential, one might be through spring tempered, and one might not be hardened at all, which does happen, and I have seen. So different requirements by different individuals, perhaps, because that person is going to be expecting to fight in this region where there's lots of people wearing chainmail armour, for example. Maybe they're campaigning on the northwest frontier against the Afghans, who like to wear lots of armour in the colder areas. And this person is going to be fighting in the south against people who fight just in, very little, essentially. Maybe tribes people using spears and bows, and they're not wearing any armour at all. So the different requirements for different swords or personal fighting styles, whether you prefer to take blows on your sword or whether you take it only on your shield and keep your sword for cutting. So that will lead to different edge geometries and different requirements for the edge and the edge hardness, whether you want a tough edge or a very hard and brittle edge that can be very super sharp, these sorts of things. So I hope that's thought-provoking and useful. I think it's a huge, massive topic for me to have tried to tackle in the length of this video, which hopefully won't have been too long for you. And as always, I'm sure on some of the metallurgical things, I'm not a metallurgical expert at all. I may have incorrectly explained some bits of them, but feel free to clarify below in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching the video. I'm interested to read your comments, your thoughts, your feedback. And I will see you really soon again on the channel for a new video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give us